So we're going to be talking about humanistic family therapies, Virginia Satir, experiential therapeutic models, and there's four different approaches. There's the Satir growth model, the symbolic experiential, emotional focus, couples therapy, and internal family systems. EFT is a popular couples model, so if you get a chance to be trained in that, that's a really great thing if you are interested in working with couples. A lot of trainings are offered to you all prior to licensure, and I would suggest, if there's things that interest you, to get trained in them now, because they're more expensive once you get licensed, because the assumption is you can afford it. So if you're interested in getting some trainings and some specializations, being a trainee or an associate is a great time to do it. Common assumptions and practices, targeting emotional transactions, warmth, empathy, and the therapist's use of self, individual and family focus. And I think, again, like we talked about strategic and structural last week, these are a little different. When you hear the word experiential, just know like there is an experience that happens with even some of the methodology and how we apply the technique. And like I've said before, and I'll continue to say it, you're going to find theory that works well with who you are and how your personality is, and you're going to find theory that would be very uncomfortable for you. So you just really have to look into like what works well for you, and what fits best with like your way of being a therapist, of course, in a legal and ethical way. This might really feel like it fits you really great, and that's great. If it doesn't, that's okay too, but it's important still to learn about it. Okay, so the different communication stances. There is congruent, there's the placator, there's the blamer, and there's the super reasonable and the irrelevant. And these stances acknowledge or minimize three realities: the self, the other, and the context. Okay, so the placator. So we can think about this as people we know. They're the person that minimizes themselves. They're people pleasers. They need less directive therapy methods. They're the one in the family that probably tries to harmonize things but gives in, doesn't maybe know their own needs or wants, but knows everybody else's. This can obviously cause resentment, some anger, frustration, but it's probably buried a little bit. Not a lot of sense of self. You got the blamer who minimizes others. So the placator minimizes themselves. The blamer minimizes others, needs to increase awareness of others' thoughts and feelings, and direct confrontation often strengthens therapeutic relationship. Okay. You could see how sometimes these people go together, because if the placator gives in, the blamer is the one that's pointing everything out, right? The super reasonable minimizes self and others. Logic and rules reign supreme. Therapists must revert to context to gain validity, right? So maybe bases everything off facts, like this is the way it is, this is truth, this is absolute truth. So probably basing things on feelings won't work super well with this person, and they will disregard some of those things. And then the irrelevant minimizes self, others, and context. No consistent grounding in self, other, or context. The therapist must increase ability to recognize thoughts and feelings of self and others. So significant contributors: Virginia Satir, John Bandman, and Maria Gomori. I would say the most popular, like from my perspective, is Virginia Satir. She has a lot of creative ways of like working with people. So you have stages. You have the status quo, the introduction of foreign element, chaos, integration of new possibilities, practice, and then the new status quo. We want to change the status quo. We want to make things different. And again, people don't come into therapy because they want to stay the same. They come into therapy because they want to change, but change is hard. And so this is something we might have to do over and over. As we know, a lot of issues that come up with people in general are reoccurring issues. Maybe they just manifest in different ways, but it's the same themes. And so we're wanting to change those themes, and we want to change the patterns that are happening in the family. Okay. So, assumption of Satir's growth model. So, people naturally tend toward positive growth. They want positive growth. All people possess the resources for positive growth. We're capable. Everything impacts and is impacted by everything else. That's kind of like a circular comment, right? And therapy is a process involving interaction between therapist and client. Each person is responsible for him or herself. And sometimes that's a hard thing for people to understand. Like, the only person you can be responsible for is yourself. We tend to think we can change people or we can cause people to behave a certain way. And the reality is, like, we can only be responsible for who we are and what we contribute to the problem, and you can see, as we're talking about the blamer or the different categorized people that we discussed before, maybe a placater is going to take responsibility for everybody else. And the blamer is going to want that person to, because they don't want to take responsibility for themselves. And so being able to navigate through that and see the different types of people in the family will be huge. Okay. And so it is true. It is like a domino effect. Everyone does impact everybody else in a family. I mentioned before about an addiction kind of cycle, like where, you have maybe the family member who's the addict, but then you have maybe the teenager that acts as an identified patient to get the attention off the addict. And then you have the perfect person. And then you have, the enabler. Like, everyone plays a role. And it's as a result of how things work out in the family. So it's like a domino effect. One thing triggers another thing that triggers another thing. And then, and that can be cyclic. And so there is room for positive growth and change, but that requires, again, taking responsibility for oneself and their contribution to the problem. So how is the therapist in this kind of model, right? So warm, you have a sense of humanness, right? You're not above anybody else. You're not stoic. You have empathy. You're conveying hope, establishing credibility, making contact, right, with the clients. So emotional role of symptom. So symptom has a role in the family system. Sometimes there's a reason for it. When I talk about that addiction model, someone needs to be the identified patient to get maybe attention off the parent that has the addiction issue. So if I'm a child that's considered identified patient, IP, that is like, maybe I'm attention seeking, I cause problems at school. So all the focus is on me, but there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason for this problem. Most situations, there's a reason for it. Maybe we don't necessarily understand it at the time, but that's what the therapist is seeking. So example here is child's exaggerated acting out may be severe to reduce tension in marriage by getting parents on the same page. So my parents don't argue if they're on the same page about my parenting me. So I'm going to cause situations so my parents don't focus on how their marriage is terrible and they focus on trying to deal with me as the kid. That may not be super on the forefront of the child's mind. It might be kind of subliminal or subconscious, but these are the kinds of things that happen and that people should be made aware of. If the therapist can understand how symptoms make emotional sense, it will be easier to help find ways to interact successfully. So the family dynamics, right? Problematic family dynamics typically involve power struggles, which we see that between parents and children, maybe even aging parents who live in the house, parental conflicts, right? Marriage issues, a lack of validation, and a lack of intimacy. We can see this in so many different ways, right? Like, I think some of our cultural mentality, at least here in the US, is kids are number one. That creates a lot of problems in relationships. Your kid's only with you for so long. And so then you're just left with your partner. And I think with that kind of mindset, you lose track of what's important. And then the kids are in charge, basically, and the parents are just running around. And then the kids are gone, and then you lost sight of your partner because we're not paying attention to our partner anymore. If we see this all the time. That's why we see a lot of divorces after a certain point in time once we raise the kids, because we're not focused on what's important and what sustains the family. Power struggles between kids and parents, power struggles between parent and parent. Everyone's fighting to rule. These cause issues. And I think even emotional intimacy can be very easily non-existent in a family, especially between partners. I think our culture, again, we're so busy. Now we introduce technology where we can scroll or mind numb. and we're not really talking to each other and getting to know one another and just sitting face to face having conversation. And so as a result, there's no intimacy, like emotionally, and then that causes issues with intimacy elsewhere too in our lives, right? So roles. Each person's role in the family is assessed to understand the function of the problem. So the therapist is looking at the family and being like, what is everyone's role? Is there a martyr? That's the person who burns at the stake for everybody else. The victim or helpless one, the rescuer, the good child or parent, the bad child or parent. What are the roles we play? Because as a therapist, then that helps you to know these are the power struggles. These are the situations. This is where there's triangulation. This is where I see like something's got to give and something's got to change. You might think of your own family and be like, oh, this person's the martyr, this person's the victim, and see those things. Family life is chronological, timeline that includes major events. So you want to get a timeline. I think timelines are great, whether it be a family situation, individual situations, a great way to identify large events that have taken place that have affected the family. And person. I think a lot of times people don't realize things that they've gone through until they sit down and do a timeline and they're like, man, I've been through it. And it's good for people to be able to identify those things. So, in here we have births, deaths. This could be a fun event to do together. The family can work together. Jobs, marriages, moves, tragedies, illnesses, maybe any sort of historical events. Like for a big one in the last, 10 years was COVID and how COVID affected all of us. COVID affected children. COVID affected individuals. It affected marriages. It affected families. It was a very hard season for so many different reasons. And that's something like most people who are, even if you have a kid who's 10, they experience that, and so that would be a large historical event that affected people, may have caused fear. Maybe it's political things that have affected people. There's a lot of different things that affect families in very serious ways, right? So this gives the therapist and the client insight and gives them context into the issues. You might even be able to say in the timeline, like, when did you notice problems arising? And so that's when people could identify at this point, and then you could try to navigate like, okay, so what was going on during that time? Survival triad, child, mother, and father, and quality of relationship between them. Is this a primary triad? We call it triangulation as well. The triad should serve as a nurturing system for child. And when the child is experiencing difficulty, the therapist considers how the nurturing function of these relationships can be improved. The iceberg. So I use the iceberg analogy a lot, but like, when we think of the Titanic sank not because of what we saw at the top, but because of everything that was below under the water. That was the iceberg. So there's layers of the iceberg. We have behavior, we have coping, we have feelings, we have perceptions, we have expectations and yearnings. So this can kind of help clients transform their feelings about feelings to make change. And again, I think the layers, like things are built upon each other, right? Even unhappy feelings are built upon each other. That's where we have layers of resentment. It's maybe not the situation that sets somebody off, but it's the layers underneath it that caused the explosion, right? It's the straw that broke the camel's back, It's like, that's so small. The reaction didn't fit, but it's because of the layers, and we have to get through the layers to see what's underneath. Self-worth, self-esteem. I don't really like self-esteem, but that word, because we're not esteeming to be better than anybody else. We just technically none of us have value or worth, but due to Christ dying on the cross for us, we do. And so we all are worthy of a healthy perception of ourselves, right? It's just a matter of how do we get there. So consider aspects of the self that the client values and aspects of which they're ashamed. Self-compassion, indicator of happiness. And as self-compassion and self-worth rise, there is more tolerance. There is more, it's easier to like see everyone being responsible for what their contribution to the problem is. Maybe there's a lack of feeling like, because I'm unworthy, I have to try so hard. And in that, it turns people off. Again, it's a proper sense of self. Again, not trying to be better than anybody else, but trying to just know, like, I have something to bring to the table. I'm part of this family. I bring something to the table. mind-body connection, how emotional issues may be manifesting in the body. And we see that often, right? We have somatic symptoms as a result of, stress, anxiety, depression, um, you know, arguments or tension. And so that can affect how we physically feel. The way the body is used indicates a person's communication stance. So we have physical things that people experience, and then we can use the body as a way of gauging what's going on. You know how I mentioned in a therapy room when you have a family session, how body language is, how eye contact is, how we sit close to one person, not to the other person, how someone touches one person and their reaction, how they act as a whole in the family. These are things that we're looking for to observe, to be like, oh, this is communicating a lot more than what they even realize, right? And so as a clinician, you're looking at those things. So then we're just trying to find goals. We're trying to figure out what we want to focus on. The goal is transformation. We want change. 2 sets of practical goals for treatment is relationally focused goals and individual focused goals to try to achieve self-actualization, and then the interventions. So, we're trying to facilitate, there's our sense of self as the clinician. We want to express emotional expression of the clients, softening family roles, more communication, sculpting, and spatial metaphor, touch. There's a lot more hands-on with experiential technique than there is in other techniques. And so they're kind of fun. It's very engaging technique. So family restructuring, group psychodrama used to allow clients to safely explore unresolved family issues and life events. Parts party, group activity similar to family reconstruction, involves client identifying group members to represent aspects of the self. I like sculpting. So sculpting is one where you can have one person be the sculptor, and they sculpt how they think what the family looks like. And this is very interesting. I've done this in sessions before, and it's very interesting because it's quiet, but the one person's the sculptor and everyone else in the family is clay. And then you have this person mold everybody how they perceive the family. It's very interesting and very telling. And so then you take turns and let each person do that kind of thing. We like this family reconstruction, we could role play, but it's very interactive, very engaging. I think clients tend to like it. It's just, there's a lot to be seen when we're quiet and we're like, what is the kid? How does the kid see the family? And you get to have this hands-on molding experience where no one's giving feedback, no one's butting in, no one's interrupting, and they're just being still and allowing themselves to be molded. And clients are able to see, oh, this is how this person feels in this circumstance. Really cool, really engaging. And as a clinician, you get to sit back and watch and observe, and then you can share what you're observing, right? It's a unique way of doing therapy, family therapy, but sometimes I think we do need to quiet down, and we don't need all the excuses and the talking and the biting back, and we just can see, oh, this is what's happening. It's very telling, really, really cool. I think once you get in there and you get to practice things as a trainee and you have a family, great technique to try to see what you think about it, how it turns out. I've done it many times with families, and I think it's really cool. But that's the great thing about when you are a trainee and you're working with clients, you get to experiment a little bit. I mean, within reason and making sure it's appropriate for the situation, but try things. Like, this is when you're learning, this is when you're growing, seeing what works for you, seeing how you apply it, seeing the outcome. Even having some mistakes sometimes and being like, that didn't go as I anticipated, but this is what happened. It's learning, and this is the time you get to learn. So anyways, I hope you guys have a great week. And you enjoy learning about some of these experiential methods, because this might be the theory that really fits you.